Welcome to The Writer's Dream. This is a show where authors can talk about how they write their books, how they publish their books, and how they market their books. You can find us on YouTube. Just look for The Writer's Dream. Or my name, Linda Maria Frank. I'm the author of Annie Tillery Mysteries. You can find us on Facebook. If you want to ask us a question or you'd like to be on the show, please message me through the Facebook page. Today's guest is Jennifer Farbar. Jennifer has been on the show before, and the discussion that we were having was so interesting that the half an hour went by and we decided that we would do the rest of the show. Jennifer is an author and she's a journalist, and she had a father who had a very interesting life, and she's writing a book about him and how he affected her life. So would you like to tell us a little bit, just a little review about Dad?
Sure, okay. Thank you for having me back, Linda. And
it's great.
A very interesting discussion. I spoke a bit, actually a good amount last time I was on your show, about just about my father and his life. And we were just speaking a little bit before we began taping, and I think something you said really struck me as being quite true, that, you know, he had some successes and he had some enormous failures. And, you know, as his child, and obviously a good part of my life perspective, having been shaped by him as being one of two adults in my house, and, you know, learning about the world and how we see and feel things through him. I think I responded to you by saying, well, I think most people's lives have successes and failures. And you said, not really on that scale. And, you know, it is, I think sometimes that what strikes me most about mental illness, from which my father suffered, is that relationships with other people are very complicated. And depending, of course, on your diagnosis, on your condition, your world can be sort of almost entirely interior. And to bring that to bear in conversations or relations with friends or relatives can be very difficult, and I think it can be very disorienting and confusing. And in my father's case, I believe that he began to really dissociate from life. And by that I mean it's a condition, and we sort of are not connected anymore to the things going on around us. And so he did enjoy some success as a book editor and then a filmmaker. And then he began to take risks and engage in a sort of behavior that a well person probably would not do. I think his behavior seems to me to indicate bipolarity, highs and lows, and risk-taking, you know, without any regard for the danger to oneself.
And he eventually committed suicide.
Yes, he did.
And actually, you wrote a wonderful article in the New York Times about his suicide. And of course, this is, I'm sure, what you're coming to grips with. Because people who have mental illness, I don't think, by and large, they understand how badly they affect everybody around them, especially those who are close to them and depend on them. So I wanted to read the last few paragraphs because they really struck me as such a different perspective on suicide.
This is the Hush of Suicide that
Yes.
I wrote? Okay.
Hush of Suicide, and it was in Hers.
The New York Times Magazine.
Hers is
right.
that section. Okay, so, all right, so shortly after the friend arrived, I pulled him aside to tell him what had happened. I guess it was a suicide. Oh no, he quickly responded, you must never challenge Buzz like that. Don't give it up again. In that moment, I realized that this man, so full of bluster and bravado, was too fearful to contemplate the reality of his friend's suicidal thoughts. In the end, after my father actually did it, he was devastated in ways that my mother, my sister, and I were not. You can deny reality only for so long. And suicide, for better or worse, is a part of human reality. I'm sick of sanctimonious screeds about wasted lives. I don't know where he is, but I do think that my father may be finally smiling. So that's a very, most people do that. They say waste of life, terrible
Yes.
thing, and
An act of anger, an act of cowardice, and it's just sort of accepted. It's discussed as though we've all agreed that this is what it is, and so we know that this happened, and this is what it's like for you, and it, as you said, the mentally ill person affects everyone around them. So, when an outsider steps in and says this was an act of cowardice and of anger toward you, basically they're saying, and I think had the good sense to, and maybe I think was the writer in me to say, hold on a minute, this is my story too. How do I feel about it? What are my feelings after all of this trauma? And, I think that the human mind is infinitely complex, and I think that great works of genius, great works of terror and violence, and great works of compassion have been committed by human beings.
Sure. And one of the questions that your work brought to my mind was, is this a memoir about your father, or is it a retrospective on suicide? So you were sharing with me that you had found a letter that you hadn't read in some time.
Yes.
So would you like to read it, and then we'll
Sure.
talk about it?
I had I just had occasion. I was moving some things around in my apartment recently, and I came across a letter that my father wrote me from prison, and how he, really the end of his life was, he was arrested. He turned on his accomplices and became what's called a rat, and then he was sent to prison, and he started writing me from prison. And when I found this, it was about 2 weeks ago, this letter, and read it, it was the most astonishing thing. I felt like, all of this guilt that I had had, or most of it, writing about my father and his illness, and exposing myself and my family to things that people might say about my writing or think, it was a completely different perspective than I had had. And the reason is that the letter so clearly indicated to me a person who was insane, and that it's something that people can recognize. And so, I just wanted to share a little bit of it.
When you're in the middle of it, sometimes you don't recognize it.
No.
Especially parent-child.
And so I was really grateful to my earlier self for saving this and not throwing it out in a fit of anger about him. And I really have learned the value of the healing power of time. And let's just keep things, don't destroy the village to save the village. It's hard to be gentle on ourselves sometimes, and the world can come in. Okay. My dear Jennifer, I received a copy of the letter, as well as your little note today, my anniversary of 12 months down. Looking back at the year, I suppose I would say it passed far more quickly than ever I would have imagined. Looking ahead to another 12 and another, and yet another, is an impossibility. Your cold, self-pitying note was disturbing on every level imaginable. If that is what you wished it to be, why then you have succeeded. You are certainly old and wise enough now, I was 22, to carry on a correspondence with someone, let alone your father, who is in prison. To respond months later with a bare note promising to write later because you are too busy now, attached to an Esquire magazine I've had to virtually beg for, I worked there, just doesn't make it, Jen. Not for you or me. And it's so interesting to me, and I just want to read a little, it doesn't make it. So he's speaking for me. And
Well, it's all about him.
It's all about him. It's all about him. And I sort of, I think, okay, you know, I'm sane. I held my ground, and I was cordial, and cordial is not quite the word, but I did keep civil with him. And his extremes of emotion and it is all about him. I know I have been a great disappointment to you, for which I am deeply sorry. And he wasn't a disappointment. He was never anything long enough to be a disappointment. Didn't it ever occur to you that I was a disappointment to myself as well? My flowers seemed to have abated in the bulb. The colors never came to light. They rotted in my chest. And do you think your actions are not disappointing to me? So here's a man who's in prison, who has basically destroyed his family with his actions. And not saying a word about, I'm so sorry for what my actions have done to our family, to you, you know, to your mom, to your sisters. Do you not think that your actions are disappointing to me? You know, one could go a lot of places with that, but one thing that occurs to me is that he is justifying his criminal behavior by saying, well, you've done things that disappointed me. I mean, any scale of or measure is not in tune with any regular standard of behavior, morality, responsibility.
Yeah, I think it's an indication of where his conscience is. And but reading this now, even maybe when you were 22, I'm not sure, doesn't it kind of alleviate some of the feeling of responsibility that you might have had
Yes.
for, you know, for whatever family dynamics there were that led to, I think he did what he did because he was him.
That's right. That's
in spite of everybody else.
And it's so helpful.
What you've told me.
To hear your
Writes
responses. Well. He writes well. And he wrote this article that appeared in Esquire magazine shortly after he went to prison. This is his photograph. His name was Bernard Buzz Farbar. And he wrote about being in prison. It's funny, people tell me that I'm a good writer, and I don't have any perspective on it. And I think that that's one thing that I'm trying to see through in some way, just beginning to really understand a lot of it. But I have a very unfriendly, skewed vision of myself, and maybe of the people in my family, because it was all very confusing when I was young. And, you know, by the time he wrote this, I was so angry at him that I felt that it was not good writing, and I felt that it was complaining about being in prison. This is how anger goes, and how dangerous anger can be left unchecked. I felt that...
But I think it was better that you were angry than...
Boy, was I angry. How dare he complain about being in prison, and he won the poetry contest, but he never got his commendation from the prison officials. You know, I was out on these, you know, I really damaged myself a lot trying to, you know, both comprehend and escape from this reality. And I had a lot of trouble with my relationships with men when I was younger. And, you know, I really felt like he had lived a whole life, and that's where he had ended up. And he was, on the one hand, saying, I miss my life, I had this wonderful life, I don't belong in prison. You know, I'm an educated person, I know writers and intellectuals, and this was, he told people he did it for the adventure. It was a hashish smuggling scheme. And then there he was in prison saying, prison is terrible, and so there was no real, I just lost my thread of thought a bit, but...
He didn't connect the experience of being in prison, the fact that he was there with his actions?
To his actions, thank you. That's, yeah.
If you had to sum up with a few sentences, what would you say the purpose of this book is going to be?
I like that what came out when I sat down to write this piece of nonfiction that I ended up submitting to the New York Times Magazine was a result of a suicide survivor group that I had attended. And again, it really struck me, and this was just the beginning. It was probably a couple of months after my father's suicide. And it was for the survivors, and we went around the room and we described how we felt. And, you know, I thought he was my father and I was his child, and watching somebody suffer and become not really functional, or the suffering, you know, subsumes a person. And I was hoping that he was happy somewhere, and that I no longer had to shoulder my part of the burden of sustaining this illusion that he was okay, that we were okay, the five of us. And I felt like, you know, a lot of questions about what is love, and I think love is caring in the most deep way that you can care about somebody else. And I certainly, as his child, had, you know, such affection for him, and wanted to see that his suffering had ended and that he might be smiling. Certainly he had had, you know, the rockiest road through life that I could ever have imagined. I hadn't even seen in books or in movies.
So that was the impetus for the article. But
Right.
what about the book? Is it the same?
You know, it's an interesting question, Linda, because I wrote that, and then I thought that would sort of become the basis for a larger memoir, and it would be about suicide and sort of the effects of it. And to a certain extent, the journalistic part became, because my father's drug case was pretty well publicized, some of the research I did involved filing Freedom of Information Act requests. So I did a couple of those, and that made the story sort of bigger than mine. It made me see there was reporting to do, and it kind of kept me grounded. And I thought, right, if I can write about this, and it's interesting how that unfolds and it becomes a story in itself. But I think we writers have to be wary of getting lost in little subterranean caves that might seem interesting. Or so I wrote to the DEA, and I wrote to the Justice Department. And the shortest answer I can give to your excellent question is that the book has changed many times over the years that I've been working on it.
But that's
which is now
good,
close
really.
to 20 years, yeah.
Because as you found out more things, I mean, I'm looking at that stack of papers, and my thought, looking at that, is that your father ended up in jail because he kept making the wrong decisions along the way.
Right.
And he made them. I'm sure he didn't come home and say, "What do you think about?"
Wow. Did
Because
he
if
ever
he
not
had.
do that? No, my goodness.
So,
No, he certainly didn't do that. And I think, you know, after the fact, that was his big thing, to come home with a problem and present it to us, or to my mom especially, and say, whatever are we going to do? Look what I've done. You know, interesting. So,
at least
you know,
you can laugh at it.
I have to laugh about it.
Yeah,
I
sure
have
you
to
do.
laugh about it.
Yep.
And I think, you know, one of our great strengths against despair is laughter. At the risk of sounding overly philosophical, it really just does.
Sure.
To laugh at yourself, to laugh at things that happen, because there is a comic absurdity to life, really, finally.
There's a comic absurdity to the human
The human condition, yeah. Yeah. That's
that
what I
makes for
meant.
good plays and good movies and
Right,
good books.
right.
And good books.
So I think really, as you know, as the book evolves, and it's a healing process for me, and I have to be kind of both forgiving of myself and persistent. As I write, it may be more than one book, and certainly the audience I first envisioned for it, I wanted to be a voice for people who had lived through things that most people don't normally talk about in polite conversation. And I really remembered after this happened that the way that books had really saved me and reassured me and kept me company when I was younger. Just, you know, certain books that really spoke to me, you know, and showed me a world and took me to a place where I was part of something other than my family, my surroundings. And it really is like, it's a spiritual thing. It's a voyage.
Sure.
And I think that as a refuge, I had hoped to kind of create a voyage for people to take, just to get off their own voyage for a little while if it was stormy and difficult or had been, to read and take some solace in the fact that this is not such an aberration. We don't really know why it happens. There's been some developments in terms of studies about genetics and so on, and depression. But is sort of the deepest part of human mystery, how we suffer, how we die, our birth and our death. And so, you know, I think my actual aim is to